Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the APAC Fall Webinar Series. My name is Kyotaro Tsutsui. I'm the Deputy Director of the Asia-Pacific Research Center here at Stanford. And this Fall Webinar Series, the theme is Asian Perspectives on the U.S. China Competition. And competition has certainly become the dominant strategic paradigm in U.S.-China relations, encompassing domains outside security and military affairs, and stretching into trade, infrastructure, technology, and development aid. So the questions are, how is the increasing rivalry between the world's two great powers influencing Asia? How do Asian nations, including Asian emerging powers, perceive the efforts by Washington and Beijing to define a zero-sum vision for the region? And how do they view and shape their futures beyond the US-China binary dynamics? Our APAC webinar series this quarter explores these and other aspects of the fallout from great power competition across Asia. You can see the lineup for the quarter, and this is today is the second installment of the series. And please also join us for the esteemed scholars and experts in examining views from the ground of what the US-China competition means for the region throughout the quarter. And for the session today, hosted by APAC's South Asia Initiative, we have the Director of South Asia Initiative, Arthur Tarapor, here. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Arthur. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyo. And indeed, as you said at the outset, that it's not just the issue of strategic competition in Asia is not just a binary issue. To set the stage for today's event, let me begin by reminding everyone that, in fact, India has been locked in its own strategic competition with China, with ebbs and flows, for longer than the United States has, right? But that competition has recently intensified in the last couple of years. And today we're not going to focus on those military dynamics between the two countries, but we're going to try and go deeper, as we usually try to do, to look at the fundamentals of India's competitive posture. We're going to ask the questions, to what extent does it have the intent and the capacity to be an effective player in the regional competition? So let me quickly unpack that. What do I mean by intent and capacity? On intent, this year, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we in the West have heard a lot more doubts expressed over the geopolitical trajectory of India, and especially the extent to which it's aligned with the United States or not. These are doubts, I stress, that are not from the US government, but from some very vocal critics. And we can easily refute most of these critiques, but they nevertheless raise an interesting question over what exactly Indian self-interest looks like. How important is the old idea of non-alignment today? What does it look like in the midst of an intensifying competition with China? And how does India balance its various relationships with various great powers? On the other side, what we might call the capacity side, long-standing questions over India's ability to be a great power, right? This is a perennial and hotly debated issue among people who study India. This year, to much fanfare, India overtook the UK to become the world's 5th biggest economy, and it will continue to grow, but the questions are how far, how fast, and is it doing all it can? To discuss both sides of this equation, we have two of the best placed and senior most observers of India's intent and its economic capacity. Very quickly, because you can read more about them on our website. Suhasini Haidar is the chief diplomatic editor of The Hindu, one of India's great journalistic establishments. She has been watching Indian politics and foreign policy for nearly 3 decades. She's won numerous prestigious awards and is, I think, one of the keenest observers of India's role in the world. Arvind Subramanian is an eminent professor now at Brown University, previously at Ashoka University. And aside from being a prolific researcher and writer, he was also critically the chief economic advisor to the government of India from 2014 to 2018. So he's, I think, perfectly placed to judge how India is performing economically. That's something I know very little about, so I hope he will use small words only. Welcome to our distinguished experts. As always, I have just one more housekeeping announcement. If you out there in Zoom land have any questions, please don't hesitate to share them. Ask them using the Q&A function, not the chat function. Time is short. I will be ruthless, so please keep them to the point. Now, let's begin. I want to start by asking each of you in turn about the recent evolution in India's intent and capacity. How did we get to where we are? Perhaps if I can start with you, Arvind, in a recent foreign affairs piece that you co-authored earlier this year, you called the period after the 2008 financial crisis, you called it India's lost decade. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Thanks, Arzan, for having me on this really distinguished panel. Great to be with Suhasini here to discuss these important issues. Yeah, very briefly, India sizzled for about 3 decades between 1980 till the global financial crisis, especially in the 2000s. This was the time when, we thought India was going to kind of really become a great power. We said China is going to be the factory of the world. India is going to be the software back office of the world. Indian growth rates were 10% in the 2000s. And this was the era of India shining. Well, essentially after the global financial crisis, India's growth slowed down considerably for a number of external and domestic reasons. I want to be studiously bipartisan here, and that to say that, the decline began under the second term of the previous government. And then, it kind of, there was some overhang from the boom era of the boom, over investments, over optimism. And so India slowed down quite considerably. And then what happened was that, this government came to power, did a few things, did not do a few things, there were kind of sins of omission, commission, but also some good things that were done. And then what happened was, and we can go through, the good and the bad, but essentially telescoping the last, decade, then we had a major, financial seizure in 2019-20. That was the first shock before COVID hit. So you have a long run slowdown, you have a financial shock in 2018, and then COVID hit. And so the sum result of all of this is that, India is recovering from the pandemic, but if you benchmark it against what happened pre-pandemic, essentially it's been a very feeble recovery from the pandemic. And so for over 10 years, slow growth, 2 shocks, feeble recovery. And so at the end of 10 years, India is still trying to kind of make its way in the world. Some good stuff has happened, and we can talk about that. But the funny thing is that, as you mentioned earlier, India is kind of the flavor du jour internationally. But I think that's partly a relative phenomenon. Adam Tooze has this thing called the South Asian polycrisis. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh are in serious macroeconomic trouble, but India stands out. It's not in kind of macroeconomic crisis, although macroeconomic situation has deteriorated, but it's not in crisis. So one relative to South Asia, India stands out well. But then the other relative where India stands out really well, of course, is China. Under Xi Jinping, China is spiraling downwards. The economy is really, most commentators think China's growth rate over the next 5-10 years is going to be low single digits. And India is still a stable, young, dynamic population. So that contrast with China, I think also makes India look good, not just as a haven of stability, but maybe as a beacon of opportunity. And of course, the most iconic evidence for that is, the Apple said it's going to start producing 5 to 10% of its Apple production, iPhone 14 production in India. So I think that, in absolute terms, it has been a lost decade. The recovery has been feeble, but suddenly India is starting to look good. I think largely because relative to, other countries which have turned south, really south, India maybe, has not turned that south. The recovery is still okay. It's still doing, there's some good things that are happening. Physical infrastructure has been built. Digital infrastructure is going on. I think on the social safety side, India has done a good job, both under the previous government and under this government. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but, I wouldn't say that India's capacity is kind of, screaming out there as something that's, really going to fill everyone with confidence about India's capacity.
Excellent, thank you. That was an excellent sort of opening response, because you've touched on many ideas and issues that I will, over the course of the next 45 minutes, try to unpack. But before we delve too much into that, Suhasini, can I ask you for a similar overview of where you see the very recent trends, especially with regard to China? Obviously, with the border crisis starting in 2020 and COVID starting in 2020, there was a rupture in the relationship. So if I can frame this opening question in this way, do you think that rupture can ever be repaired or stabilized, or is there just no going back to the old days?
Well, I'd like to come to the rupture by building up to what we saw before it. And it is not as if India has not had concerns about China's rise in the last decade and a half. There has been a sense since 2008 that China was moving in a much more assertive direction, and the world has seen that. There is no question that Deng Xiaoping's earlier ideas of hiding your light, biding your time, and essentially not being seen as a competitor in the world has been set aside. That really came to a fruition with the advent of Xi Jinping. And since 2013, if you like, India has had to deal or contend with the idea that China is no longer looking to make some kind of a conciliation with India. That China sees itself as the foremost power in Asia, and as a result will not look at India's rise as something, the earlier ideas of the Asian century only coming through if India and China are partners over here. So India has contended with it, and this has been across governments. I would say since 2008, there has been some growing concerns. But what we have seen in the last few years, first in 2014, where there was an intrusion at the same time, an incursion at the same time as Xi Jinping traveled to India, perhaps some kind of a strong message there. In 2017, where Chinese soldiers sought to take over an area of the Doklam Plateau, which was at a tri-junction between Bhutan and India. And now what you referred to in April 2020, where Chinese soldiers amassed along the line of actual control, brought in a lot of equipment, established infrastructure along the line of actual control, and then carried out incursions into disputed territory with India. One of those incursions resulted in the Galwan clashes, where 20 Indian soldiers died. Chinese have admitted to 4 of their soldiers dying. We don't know if there were more casualties. So this is what we have seen over the last, as you said, in the recent years. The last one, what has happened with April 2020, I think the shift has been much more of a rupture in ties with the Indian people. The government, remember, and I think you referred to this, the government, if you look at its statements, has not actually officially even accepted that Chinese soldiers came into Indian territory or Indian claimed disputed territory. we have only one single statement from Prime Minister Modi made in June 2020, 3 days after the Galwan clashes, where he said no one is inside Indian territory, no one came inside Indian territory. He has never updated that statement. Mr. Jaishankar makes very repeatedly, regular remarks about the idea that that there can be no going back, that there can be no business as usual with China unless we are able to resolve the situation at the LAC. But we actually don't have a government version of what is there at the LAC. But what we can see is that the relationship has ruptured. The relationship has ruptured very much in terms of the relationship with the people of India. There is absolutely no trust. And remember, we come from a backlog of the 1962 war. So that was not something that Indians could ever shrug off. But now it seems very clear that they don't foresee a future in which this China-India, sort of togetherness is going to be pushed beyond a point. The government did take certain actions. We saw some economic measures. We saw the fact that things like TikTok were banned, or that there was a go slow on Chinese investment into India. There was a very open moving away from companies like Huawei and ZTE, which may even have to shut down in India in the next few months. Many actions opened against Chinese companies in India. But despite that, we have this phenomenon of India-China trade growing to record levels, crossing 100 billion in this year. And I think for the first time, the annual two-way trade has crossed. It's about 125.6 billion. But India's imports have grown even more in a very worrying fashion. So about 95.6 billion of those are India's imports from China. So we've not been able to yet see that, sort of a rupture, if you like, on the trade side that many had thought was going to happen, a decoupling from China. But then we can even see that the United States is having its own issues with decoupling, even though they've taken so many legislative measures. I think where the future of this goes is perhaps when you say, is there no going back? Possibly there is no going back. There's no going back to a time when there will be full, complete trust in what China does with India. And I think Xi Jinping has shown, not just in China's moves at the LAC, but China's moves towards Taiwan, China's moves in the South China Sea, that this is part of Chinese policy now. Don't take us for granted anymore. Don't think that we are going to work just as, put our heads down and try to work in a certain way. This is an era of Chinese assertion. So that part of the rupture is not going to go away. We're at an interesting time today because this is November. We're just a couple of weeks away from the Bali G20 summit. And I think all eyes are going to be on what happens with President Putin coming in there. All eyes will be on whether there's a Biden-Xi meeting, which is possible given that the foreign ministers have spoken on the telephone. But I think equally for us in India, we're watching very closely if there is any kind of détente between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, because this is one of the few opportunities they're going to have. They were together more than a month ago at Samarkand for the SCO summit, but there was no public contact between them. But will there be one at Bali? Will be interesting to watch, simply because India also goes into a new phase. It takes over the presidency of the G20. It's already taken over the presidency of the SCO, which really means that next year, Mr. Xi is going to be invited to visit India for 2 summits. Right now, we're not sure exactly whether they'll be held together, one after the other, or a little far apart. But the truth is that this is now a new moment we're looking at with India. How much is the Modi government going to be able to risk political capital by making those, any kind of, as you said, going back, any kind of détente with China at this time will be very interesting. I don't think it's impossible, however.
That's great, and I want to pick up on that. I've got a handful of questions on this sort of what I'm calling the intent side, but let me start with that issue I'm not going to ask you to make an impossible call on whether there'll be a handshake in Bali or anything like that. But what I want to know is, you mentioned that there's been a rupture among the Indian people, right, and their views of China. But on the other hand, the government, Modi's government, has quite deftly sort of tried to keep its options open, not be boxed in by sort of claiming any specific reality on the ground. So if you zoom out a little bit, forget this meeting or that meeting, but if you zoom out a little bit, how much political latitude does the government have to allow this situation to continue and just sort of quietly, slowly rebuild a relationship of détente? Because as Jaishankar has also said, the two giants of Asia cannot be in this situation profitably for long. There are interests in repairing at least elements of the relationship. So is that politically viable in India?
Well, the way I would answer that question is to take a look at, and there's no question that if Xi Jinping has changed China's assertiveness in the world, I would say the Modi era in India has changed India's assertiveness in its region in various ways. So the way to look at the political leverage they have, or the political space they have, would be to compare how the Modi government has treated Pakistan vis-a-vis how it has treated China. With Pakistan, there have been very decisive actions to push back against any kind of terrorism suspected to have come from Pakistan. There were the Uri strikes, where India openly announced that soldiers had crossed the line of control, a UN-monitored line, in order to carry out strikes. There were the Balakot strikes, where India sent missiles in, bombed a part of non-disputed Pakistan. These are all precedents that we have never seen before, and has been quite, politically empowered by it. The 2019 election arguably was won on the plank that the Modi government was going to carry out unprecedented military action against Pakistan. On the other hand, you see what the government has done with China. As I pointed out, they've never actually updated the world or India by saying Chinese have entered Indian territory. Even though, we at the Hindu have been covering it, military reports come out, satellite pictures show that China has not only moved into disputed territory, but has amassed infrastructure in parts of it that is going to be very difficult to reverse. What is the area in which the government can work? We know that they have not broken off talks. Military talks have continued. There have been round upon round. In the old days, this mechanism they had called the WMCC met maybe twice a year at the most. Now we've had close to, I think, 15 or 18 rounds in just these 2 years between the two countries. We've seen 6 rounds of disengagement occur between them, and I think that has given the government some space to work with China. The fact that we have not had a repeat of Galwan is again something that shows intent. Beyond that, I would say that this is a strong government in India. This is a government that can get away with risks it takes. Prime Minister Modi, remember, even with all the kind of nervousness about China in the last few years, Prime Minister Modi met with President Xi Jinping one-on-one 18 times before 2020. 2 of those meetings ran into hours and hours at Wuhan, at Mamallapuram, where they spoke to each other for hours. It is inconceivable that the leaders of the two countries would have had these long amounts of, engagement on a bilateral one-to-one level without some discussion about the way forward, where they saw the future of the boundary dispute and the resolution, which Prime Minister Modi came into power in 2014 saying he was going to resolve. He was very clear at that first Xi Jinping meeting that this was something that was going to have to be resolved. So I do think that this is a government that can try, will have more area for dealing with China, but that trust factor has gone. And therefore, they will be, what happened in Doklam, what happened in Galwan can be, sort of pushed aside for a little bit, but any other incursions are going to be very difficult for any government to explain. And we do have a 3,500-kilometer boundary with China. Those incursions can occur at any of those points if one or the other side decides to get assertive. So it's going to be a very tricky slope. And I know that we're going to discuss this later, but it's one of the reasons I've consistently held that what China did in 2020 has also changed India's strategic calculations when it comes to how much resource it is going to have to put into its continental boundaries versus the plans for cooperation with the United States and other Western countries when it comes to the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm completely with you on that point as well. And so on that point, I want to ask a question of both of you now, Suhasini and Arvind, on this issue of Indian capacity as an enabler for its policy towards China. So some critics have suggested that India simply does not have the wherewithal to take on China in the same way, as you've pointed out, that it can with Pakistan. Some people say that India has not gone far enough or fast enough to balance China. And so the question I have for both of you, but from a slightly different point of view, Suhasini, I'll ask you in a second about whether you think it just comes down to power, or is there something else to it? Is there some other issue of political preference? But Arvind, if I can bring you back in, regarding this issue of India's growth as compared with China's growth, as you brought up earlier, for years that delta has been growing between India and China. So what's your prognosis for that delta? Are we now anticipating that that delta will shrink and that India has a prospect of closing the gap in national power with China?
Yeah. First of all, before we speak of deltas, we have to, start with the status quo. For the status quo, the differential is, rule of thumb, multiply everything India does by a factor of 3 to 5, whether it's, GDP or GDP per capita or defense expenditures or whatever. So we're starting with a very differential set of what you would call, what in the old days used to be called, power and capacity and all of that. I think that, before I talk about the delta, I think there are 2 or 3 dimensions of the broader economic relationship is actually worth reflecting on. One is that, as Suhasini rightly pointed out, that the trade relationship has grown, but it's not just that it's grown in a way that seems, adverse for India, because India's trade deficit with China has increased enormously. And in some ways, Indian discussions of the trade deficit with China resembled, U.S. discussions of the trade some time ago under Trump. But it's not just that. It's, the pattern of trade is what, in the old days we would say was kind of core and periphery. India basically exports a lot of raw materials and, exports a lot of raw materials and imports, kind of finished goods, equipment, and so on. So it seems not just an unequal relationship in terms of magnitude, but also in terms of the pattern of trade. My own sense is that that is part of the reason why India has not engaged. For example, India has not joined RCEP, for example, which is one of the most dynamic trade arrangements. Of course, going forward, things are going to be a bit more complicated. But I think part of the reason why, if one had to be a little bit crude and reductive about it, basically India joining RCEP would be India opening its market to China, and because already there's this, huge trade deficit. It's a kind of unequal relationship. So India has been kind of reticent to join RCEP. There are other reasons, but also this fundamental fear that India cannot compete with China, partly because China also engages in all these subsidization and unfair currency manipulation, or all those things. So I think so that's one dimension to the relationship. Going forward, of course, now we come to the delta a little bit. I mean, it seems like now going forward that the delta will be, probably in favor of India. It seems like that is the case. But I think that India cannot, take that for granted because, India's own ability to deliver sustained rapid growth is going to be, cannot be taken for granted. In the foreign affairs piece, we're a little bit cautious about India's ability to really grow gangbusters once again. But the delta will therefore come about in India's favor, largely because China is kind of really screwing up. Xi Jinping is screwing up on the economic front. However, that I think it's not just the delta, but Suhasini should correct me if I'm wrong, but the broader geopolitics of what has happened has been that capital now is going to be much more leery, not just in terms of new investments in China, but also relocating existing investments. So in that sense, the delta is already creating opportunities for India. But it's not just the economic delta, but it's also the geopolitical sphere. And it is inconceivable that even 3 years ago, Apple would have said, we're going to, this is a place that's very difficult to do business in. It's inconceivable that Apple could have said, no, we're going to come to India. And so in that sense, I think there is going to be a double delta in India's favor, Chinese growth declining, but the geopolitics changing in India's favor. And that is going to be the last point I will say is on capability and capacity. I think India has to be a little bit cautious here because in some ways, in terms of capacity, there's kind of like a triple, I wouldn't say a whammy, but, triple note of caution. One, the differential is so great that India's ability to spend more on defense is going to depend a lot on how fast it can grow. And that I think India's growth potential, I think, is not to be exaggerated. It's fairly limited. That's point number one. Point number two is that within that envelope, how much will be spent on social security and the other things that the Modi government wants to do versus spending on defense, that too is going to be circumscribed. Third, even within the defense envelope, India's, if you look at the composition, pensions and salaries and wage payments, take up a very large share of defense expenditures. So if you really want capacity to, invest in modern equipment, et cetera, you have to grow, your defense budget has to grow, and within the defense budget, equipment over salaries, pensions. In the last few years, as you know, the defense pension budget has completely gone out of control because of, whatever economic populism and having to do this. So one has to be careful about, projecting capacity based on the delta because, of all these factors that I've enumerated.
Okay, great. Now, hang on. There's a couple of really tantalizing points that you just raised. And Suhasini, I hope you've been taking notes because I'm going to ask again, both of you, Arvind, if I can ask you a quick follow-up on a couple of points, and then Suhasini also. The two quick follow-ups that I have are, one, can you reliably say that as firms reconsider their position in China, that India stands to benefit? Right, because initially, of course, that was the hope, but some of those hopes, I believe, were reconsidered. So that's point number one. And point number two, again, for both of you as well, is it enough to just grow the pie, the economic pie, or is there also, and I'm really badly mixing metaphors here, is there also political appetite to shift the guns versus butter balance within the pie? that is a growing and a more prosperous and a more economically powerful India likely to spend a greater proportion of its resources on defense? For both of you, please.
Yes. So let me answer the first question. I think the second, I think Suhasini will probably have a better view than I will on this. So it's a very good question, because after the global financial crisis was the first opportunity created because China was becoming naturally uncompetitive, and so was actually ceding export space. In fact, Soumitra Chatterjee and I have a paper where we said after the global financial crisis in about 2018, China actually vacated about $150 billion of exports. And in that episode, India was able to take very little advantage of that, because the domestic investment climate, or whatever, India was not competitive enough. The investment climate was not, competitive enough. So the first natural experiment, India fell short. By the way, in that episode, the countries that really benefited from that were Vietnam, Indonesia, ASEAN, and to some extent Bangladesh as well. Now we have a second opportunity created by geopolitics and a further deterioration of the economy. And here too, I think the Apple thing notwithstanding, there is no automatic translation from opportunities being created to opportunities being realized. I mean, India will have to do a lot, because it is not at all clear. And I think that, there are, many things we can talk about, but in terms of the government's ability to create a level playing field between, foreign investors, between foreign and domestic investors, that level playing field is not to be taken for granted. Because if anything, I would argue, and I've used this phrase called, India's promoting certain national champions. I call this the 2A version of stigmatized capitalism in India, because, a few groups are being favored. So the sense that the playing field is not level could fundamentally be an impediment to opportunities not being realized. If I were an investor in India and I looked at the landscape and said, I certainly don't want to be in the same space as these 2As, because, the regulatory playing field is going to be really tilted in their favor. And again, so the, whether the Apple is a one-off or is going to be a sustained flow, I think is far from clear at this moment. And on the second point, I leave it to Suhasini, because, you're right. But just to emphasize, it's, faster growth for more resources, then the decision to, devote more of that to defense, and then within defense to devote more of that to equipment. And then finally, the point, I would love to hear Suhasini on this as well. Remember, India's ability to procure defense equipment has been historically very problematic. Maybe recently there's some changes. So there are actually 4 hurdles to cross if you want to convert, to go from resources to actually the meaningful defense investments we need to face the kind of 2-front challenge that India faces now.
Okay, so Suhasini, we have both given you lots of questions, so pick and choose whatever has seized your imagination.
Okay, to begin with, has India been able to take advantage of what Professor Subramanian referred to as the second big, opportunity that it had? And yes, the Apple example, we are waiting to see if it translates into others. However, we're looking at the geopolitics of the world actually changing. What do we do post-Ukraine is going to be very different And this is going to be true of Western economies as much as they would like to bilateralize all economic relations. Look at what we've seen in the last 8 months. There is a growing polarization economically, which has meant essentially that there is one group of countries that are imposing sanctions on Russia, and another group of countries, which is far larger, that is not part of any sanctions on Russia. Is this going to go forward? We don't know how the Ukraine conflict will end, so I'm going to leave that part of the equation open. But I do want to make the point that if India remains in this camp, in fact, on the same side, if you like, as China, where it will not take part in sanctions against Russia, where it is not going to accept the kind of strictures on investment in Russia. In fact, India has done exactly the opposite. Trade is actually growing 120% this year with Russia. Oil, that, Mr. Jaishankar famously said in February, we only take about 2% of our, or less than 2% of our oil from Russia. Today, by December, we will be hitting more than 20%, possibly even as much as 24% of our oil intake from Russia. Russia, that was nowhere on India's map when it came to an oil provider, is today number 2 after Iraq. India has not taken part in this kind of Western trend, if you like, when it comes to the geoeconomics of the outcome of the Ukraine war. So we put that opportunity aside. The second part has been the idea that India would now be the natural beneficiary of money coming out of China. That has been, the Trump administration pushed it. The Biden administration has certainly gone a step further. And we've seen 2 or 3 things happen there. The first is that India's domestic investment climate hasn't actually come up to where they can, in fact, if you look at just this year, and obviously COVID is a factor, we're seeing another month of net outflows when it comes to foreign portfolio investment, for example. Then it comes to the actual manufacturing investment, which we're not really seeing. At the same time, there is a government a notion of Atmanirbhar, many big ticket announcements of make in India factories. We don't know whether those are going to fructify. The third thing we've seen is, for example, what the US has done with the CHIPS Act, where maybe a part of this supply chain India had hoped to bag. But now it looks as if the US is taking a lot of that supply chain back to the United States and back to factories and building manufacturing back in the United States itself. And the last part of this equation, which may or may not fit in with anything that you have said so far, is really India's own relationship with its democracy. Remember, India stands out as opposed to a China or even a Russia or other countries of that nature, because it is a democracy. When we talk about the Quad, it's a coalition of democracies. When we talk about the D10, it is about developing countries that are that are actually democracies. As far as India is concerned, it's also its exclusive factor from China. That as long as India remains a pluralistic, inclusive, harmonious, non-majoritarian democracy, it has something over China. If that falters in any way, or the perception of India as a democracy falters in any way, you are going to see many more questions being asked. After all, even in just a pure economic term, you look at the US or European investors. First, they were told by the Trump administration, pull out of China. This is not going to go well for everyone. Now they've been told, pull out of Russia. Many countries, when it came to Russia, actually just unilaterally, without even waiting for sanctions to hit their part of the business, they pulled out because they knew where this was headed. I'm not in any respect predicting that kind of future for India, but I'm just saying that if you have already been burned twice with this notion of a country no longer being on the same value page as the West, are you going to put your eggs in a basket which may or may not work in quite that respect. So I would think all of this actually comes together when it comes to India's capacity. At the end of the day, India is such a huge market for itself that I have no doubt that even if it was to take a much more protectionist turn and say, I don't really care about what the world thinks about my democracy or my human rights, the government certainly is now even redefining what democracy means. So you will have Western democracy, you will have Chinese characteristics of democracy, because after all, the Chinese seem to think they have a democracy as well. And you will have India redefining. This is something we've heard from Mr. Jaishankar again and again, that our idea of democracy is not the same as the West. So if you do go down that path, I have no doubt that India will have many years of growth even so. But when it comes to investment, when it comes to engaging with, and please excuse this dog of mine who has decided he wants to somehow be part of the frame, you will see that when it comes to external investment in India, you will not necessarily see a secular trend of growth. It will depend on each of these issues, the geopolitics, the geoeconomics that comes out of it, as well as India's own protectionism, the US's own protectionism. That's something we have begun to be concerned about. And finally, to India's relationship with its own democracy.
Sensational. So you've actually...
Can I just say one thing,
Please,
just to add?
Please.
You see, maybe just to inject a little bit of, a small amount of daylight between me and Suhasini. I think that the notion, I completely agree that, as I said, these may be opportunities, but to realize them, India will have to do much more to create a better investment climate in India. But the notion that Indians have that we're really a big enough market, to attract foreign investment, I think that's a bit overdone. If you look at, actually the size of the Indian market relative to any global market, it's actually quite small. And we have some numbers on this. So if India wants to really attract foreign investment sustainably and of sufficient magnitude, they will not come just to service the Indian market, because that's kind of not huge. I mean, the really only sustainable investment that foreigners will come for in the medium to long run is if they can use India to service the global market. I mean, after all, the capital that left China to go to Vietnam and Indonesia and ASEAN was not to service their domestic markets, was in fact because they could in turn use these to service the international market. So in a sense, I'm just adding to the kind of caution we should have about taking for granted that we will get all this investment. And there, of course, if you want to be part of, to service, in fact, the global market, then India's recent inward turn, as we have argued, is going to kind of go against that to some extent. Just to give you one example, if you're out of, say, a dynamic Asian market, then for an investor that comes to India to sell into that dynamic market, you're just discriminated against because you're not part of these trade arrangements. So the domestic market is not big enough. And if you want to access the international market, not only do you have to create an investment climate that's conducive, but also, you can't afford to have a policy of self-reliance and excluding yourself from dynamic international markets.
So you've both already touched on, and we've only got a few minutes left. So I'm glad you guys have already raised this issue that I wanted to raise, which is the idea of the interaction between the intent and the capacity, right? The extent to which political preferences shape a country's prospects for growth and power. Now, you've raised, both of you, this self-reliance issue, right? Atmanirbhar. Can you, Arvind, explain to us, you touched on this, you alluded to this. Can you give us a sense of, in fact, not just that, but when you take that in combination with the other political factors that Suhasini raised, the post-Ukraine world, which is a world that post-dates your foreign affairs article, the idea of high-tech decoupling from China, and the idea of democracy, India's particular form of democracy. Can you give us a sense of the net effect of those political factors on India's growth trajectory? Are they impediments?
I think the problem with with many of these things. So just to give you one example, take the point that finally investors will care about democracy and being part of being kind of one of us, as it were. As I've said, going forward, the issue is not whether the world is going to deglobalize or reglobalize. It's this whole notion of there may be pockets of globalization. We the democracies we globalize, even accentuate globalization, but across between us and them there's kind of deglobalization, right? The problem with this is that it's very difficult to predict timing. For example, I mean, we know that a country that's doesn't have social harmony, that doesn't have that there's no guarantee that in the long run there's going to be social peace and no major chaos and so on. In the long run, it's going to be difficult to attract investment, but it's very difficult to predict because Apple has come to India and so they've taken a bet that maybe for the next 5, 10, 15 years things will be sufficiently under control. As someone famously said, never predict the magnitude and the timing of a crisis. You can predict one or the other. You can't predict both. So I think in that sense, it's very difficult. But what we can say is that, there's no doubt that opportunities are being created for India. I mean, I think that, the global landscape has changed considerably. The question is how much gets translated. And I think that all I can say is that all the things that Suhasini has mentioned and I've mentioned will kind of come in the way of translating those opportunities into real kind of investments and actual growth takeoff. How much, to what extent, and when, I would be very cautious about predicting.
Thank you. So, Suhasini, I want to turn back to you, given that we're running short on time. I want to ask one sort of broader, overarching question. We've touched on the issue of China and to what extent India's policy to China is just a function of power, or is it also a function of politics? We've touched on Atmanirbhar. We've touched on a number of other issues, right, including Russia. My question to you is, this is a government that is very self-consciously sensitive to Indian national power. And yet there are things that sometimes it does that prima facie, and maybe I'm getting it wrong, but prima facie seem to not serve that purpose of growing Indian national power. So then what else explains some of these positions? Is there anything else aside from, and I don't want to sort of resort to sort of easy answers, but is there an underlying political preference that is getting in the way of Indian power?
Interesting. And I think what we are looking at is uncharted territory, because, you have a government that wants to be the first to do things. It wants to say we are doing things differently, even where in areas where it seems as if there's continuity in Indian foreign policy. Actually, you're seeing the government stake a claim to say, no, they're doing it differently. So a lot of this is about our analysis of whatever they say they're doing. Now, in there is the idea of strategic autonomy, which used to be the idea of non-alignment. I've written, I'm not sure it was taken seriously, it may have been half facetiously, the idea that this government feels they can get away with all alignment. In other words, that they can be part of Quad and also part of the SCO and BRICS, that they can have a stronger strategic partnership with the United States than ever before, with the European Union than ever before, but actually have a stronger relationship with Russia than ever before. The idea that they are in the sweet spot where nobody is going to ask them to choose. These are all ideas that have built into where India is standing right now. It is not so much about ideology. It is seen as a matter of real politics. We heard from the petroleum minister, and I think it meant the same for every part of Indian the economy, where he said India will buy oil wherever it can. Now, this is not completely true, because just 4 or 5 years ago, India cut, or 3 years ago, India zeroed out its oil from Iran and Venezuela, simply because they were threatened by the Trump administration with sanctions. The idea, so what we're seeing is essentially India is reacting to where potential power is. I have also held, and I don't know if this pertains exactly to your question, but that there are 3 phenomena in the world that are going to decide India's future and perhaps other futures as well. One is the rise of China. It is defining India's choices in a very, very particular way. The second is the perceived decline of the United States. I'm not one of those who's going to make that prediction about the decline of the US, because so many have betted wrongly against the US and its capacity to reinvent itself. But what we have seen is a sort of inability perhaps to match its intentions with actual power. And the fact that the Ukraine war has gone on long enough, the fact that we have a Quad relationship which doesn't actually show results just yet, that you have an IPEF framework that the US comes into, an India, a country that has said no to RCEP, also says no to being part of the trading pillar of IPEF. So the second is the perceived, the perception that the US may not come through. And the third is the rise of the alpha men. Where is this great populist phase around the world going? Do the elections in the United States or in Brazil or in places where we have seen a more centrist turn of the electorate represent a greater trend, or is it the continuing trend we have seen since the 2012s, 2013s of alpha men around the world who will basically do what it takes for their national power moment inside their own countries, and foreign policy is actually just a factor of winning the next election within their country. So I'll leave it there.
So maybe just a
Please.
final thought. I think looking ahead, coming back to my theme of the relative thing, it seems like everyone is in decline. The only question is who's going to relatively decline more. That's going to determine the fate going forward of the world. And it seems to be that China is declining, but there's a lot of polarization in the US as well, which is going to determine US ability to project power internationally. So we don't know how that's going to play out. So it's all it's like the famous joke about the economist turns to his wife and says, "Honey, do you love me?" And she says, "Relative to what?" So maybe that's where we are now.
Or can you just assume the love? Arvind, if you will indulge me, I have one question that I've been dying to ask, and you can answer it as briefly as you want. And that is there a sense when you talked in your foreign affairs piece about the difference between the hardware and the software, the reforms that have happened and have not yet happened, the sins of commission and omission, as you've put it, is there a deadline for India to undertake the necessary economic reforms? Is there a finite window of opportunity after which anything that the Indian government does economically will have a smaller or a less effective impact?
I generally don't like these notions of deadlines or lists. I think that the more you delay them, the more costly. That's all one could say. And the less you do, the more costly. But there's no real, I mean, they say one window is the demographic dividend in India. That's we're in the peak of it. It's going to decline. But in the last 10 years, the demographic dividend has not been a huge dividend because a lot of it depends upon what we do internally to convert. Demography is not destiny. It's it's an opportunity or a curse depending on what you make of it. So I think I'm not a big believer in deadlines and windows. It's just that the quicker you reverse what I call the software of economic policy making, the more you do quicker, the better in terms of India's long run potential. But there's a lot of software that needs remedying in India.
Thank you so much. I know you have to run, so I thank you very much for your time and your expertise and your insights. Thank you very much. Suhasini, I've got one more question, if you will indulge me. And that is essentially the political version of this last question that I just asked Arvind. So the political version in my mind is there among India's partners, especially the United States, the Quad, the new partners that India has embraced, is there a sense that that they have finite patience with India, that India's potential, if it continues to be unrealized, will squander the opportunity India has to forge these partnerships and to use them to grow its own power? Or is there a sense that there is always going to be patience simply because India has so much potential?
Well, I think the answer to how much patience they have is better asked in perhaps other countries. I think in the Indian assessment of things, India is India. It has always had a certain punching above its weight in the world, despite its disparities, despite its inequalities within. It has had a very particular role in the world. It cannot be ignored, and I think that is now an accepted place. How much patience are countries going to have politically with India's hedging, with India's refusal to perhaps be counted in one camp or another? I think so far, Prime Minister Modi and perhaps Indian foreign policy has won that bet. They have been able to show that they have been, they have not taken the stands that people wanted in the very, very short term. If you look at close to, I think, 15 or 16 United Nations votes, while India is in the Security Council, where India has simply abstained. And there are no consequences for that. I think that bet has paid off in some ways. But I do want to make that point. And I know this is not something where I speak on behalf of others. There are others that just see India's rise and fall in terms of economic factors and in terms of strategic factors and in terms of the fact that it is, it is the last hedge, if you like, against countries like Russia and China. Which other country in Asia can take on the size of China with some amount of support from the rest of the world, after all? But I do think that India's USP remains its democracy, remains the fact that it is perhaps the only country of its size in the world that has as much diversity inside it, that has as many I don't want to use the word ethnicity because we're essentially the same ethnicity, but has as many types of languages, regions, religions. I don't think that there is a parallel in the world. If India continues to be an inclusive, pluralistic, secular democracy, then that is the USP. That is what attracts people to India and has attracted people to India over the ages. If that goes away, if India turns into some majoritarian, non-pluralistic, very strong, in the mold of a Turkey, for example, or a Hungary, I think it gives away that USP. And then the differential between India and China will come down to just economics. How many cycles can I sell there, or how much manufacturing I can do there? And it won't be about this very special place that India has in the world, where it is able to straddle both spheres without facing too much damage for it. That is an excellent way to conclude. Thank you, Suhasini. I think
your final point really underscores one of the themes that's come out for me in this webinar, which is that the competition with China is not just, in India's case, on the LAC. It's not even, as some of us keep hammering on about, across the region and the Indian Ocean. It's about global politics, it's about the national economy, and it's about national identity and character, right? The competition with China has brought all of these things into sharper relief. So thank you for making those points. Thank you to you, to Arvind, to your dog, and to everyone out there in Zoom land. We'll see you next time.